righty, I think we're going to get started. So Dr. Camille Carroll is going to talk to us about how patient involvement in trial design is having an impact.
Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be back in Grand Rapids and to be back presenting at this meeting. It's lovely to see you all. My name is Camille Carroll. I'm a neurologist based in Plymouth in the UK. And I'm going to talk about involving people with Parkinson's and the care partners in trial design and a bit about the impact that that can have on studies. So I'll start from the beginning. I'm sure this is telling you thoughts that you've already had, but thinking about involving people in studies, why is clinical research important at all? Because of course, what we know about Parkinson's, a lot of what we know about Parkinson's comes from laboratory research. And this has been talked about a lot in meetings, in this meeting. So cell culture studies, animal studies, test tube, and now of course, computer-based studies tell us a lot about what causes Parkinson's, what might be causing it to progress, the risk factors for Parkinson's. All of this is laboratory based. But in order to translate that back into how this is going to impact care for people with Parkinson's, really what we need to do is involve people with Parkinson's in the next iteration of those studies, because the best clues about what is actually happening, of course, come from people with Parkinson's yourselves. What do we understand about the disease course? How is Parkinson's affecting you over time? Which other bits of the body are being affected? What is it that we can measure about your Parkinson's, whether it's in blood or urine or skin or a brain scan? And how does this then relate back to what we saw in the experimental models? Because of course these aren't Parkinson's. This is just based on our understandings. There's sort of a two-way loop here, which can help. And then when we come up with a treatment, which, we periodically do, and there are a lot of treatments, potential treatments. When I say treatment, I'm talking about disease modifying treatments now rather than symptomatic treatments. But when we think about treatments, we need to then show that they work. And of course, we can show that they work in cell culture models, we can show that they work in animals, and that's very exciting and interesting. But actually what we need to do, of course, is show that they work in people with Parkinson's, because that's the end goal. And in order to be sure that a treatment is suitable for people with Parkinson's to use in the clinic, we need to know that it's safe, that it's having a clinical effect, that's doing something of value, and to make sure that that value is then realized by people living with Parkinson's, that this isn't helping in a way which actually isn't impacting life course, because that isn't going to be an effective treatment. So fair enough then, we'll just design a study to evaluate our treatment, check for safety, check for clinical impact, check for quality of life, and we'll recruit some folks into the study. Is that enough? Well, it isn't enough. And the reason that isn't enough is because actually we don't do this well. If we look at data, this is not specific to Parkinson's, this is data from across clinical trials, we know that only about half the trials actually recruit the number of people that they thought they needed to recruit in order to answer the scientific question. And around 20% of people recruited to trials don't finish that trial. They will drop out for various reasons. And of course, people drop out for all sorts of really valid reasons, like life gets in the way. It might be related to side effects of the medication or any number of things. And we know that some groups, particularly women, the more elderly, the more frail, those living in harder to reach geographical regions, people that live in rural areas or coastal areas, people with poor public transport infrastructure or poor digital connectivity, people from ethnic minorities, people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, all those sorts of people are much less likely to take part in studies. And what that means is that even if we find a result of a study which is positive, we don't have the confidence to know that this finding is generalizable to the whole population that we would necessarily want to treat with that therapy. So we assume safe in There's the 60 to 65-year-old chaps who've taken part in the study, but what is that telling us about the 78-year-old Bangladeshi lady? Is that drug really going to be safe for her? And we don't know. And of course, this is not peculiar to Parkinson's. This is a situation across a lot of therapeutics for a lot of disease areas. And we are now, as a society, starting to realize the impact of that, and some really salient learning points around cardiovascular trials, for example, and the disparity that has become played out through time, with the trial data being based on one demographic and not applying to another demographic, and that means that other bits of society have actually been disadvantaged because the trial data are not there to support those therapies being used safely and effectively. Healthcare inequalities are a real issue. It's a real issue in the UK. I imagine it is globally. In order to address these, we need to have evidence which pertains across society. So getting inclusive participation in trials is an absolute urgent need. And we know that if we want people to take part in studies, people need to trust the people running those studies, asking them to participate. These are conversations not so difficult to have, but they're nuanced conversations. They're not sort of part of ordinary healthcare provisions. So healthcare providers, the nurses, doctors, practitioners need to understand trials, need to understand what it is that's being asked of you as participants or potential participants. And if that person advises you that they think this is a really good study for you to take part in, from which you are likely to benefit, and you've got a trusting relationship with that clinician or practitioner, you are much more likely to take part in that study. And in order for the healthcare practitioner to relay the trial in a way that you will feel is positive, patients need to have been involved in the design of that. So they can look you in the eye and say with real confidence, this is going to be a great study for you. You will enjoy taking part in it. The outcome for you will be positive. And by that, I don't mean whether the drug will work or not. I mean, the participation experience in the study will be a positive one. And we know that people who take part in studies have better healthcare outcomes on the whole, even if they're in the placebo group, than those who don't take part in studies. So taking part in studies is a positive experience. So thinking more about Parkinson's then, Parkinson's does have its own particular challenges. And what we want to do is find a disease modifying therapy. And by that, we mean therapies that slow, stop or reverse the progression of Parkinson's. And when we design a trial like this, there's always a balancing act. There's no perfect trial, there's no perfect answer, there's no perfect solution. What we want is we want to measure the biggest possible difference from our therapy compared with placebo, but we want to find that difference in the shortest possible time. And we've heard in the other room, I'm sure also spoken about in here today, about the need to continue trials for a long enough duration in order to pick up a difference. We're very unlikely to pick up a difference in a 3 to 6 month time frame, but of course we want to find a difference in a 3 to 6 month time frame. We want to measure Parkinson's really comprehensively. We understand that this is not a purely motor condition. It doesn't just affect movement, it affects all sorts of aspects of function, thinking, mood, bladder, bowels, sweating, blood pressure. And of course, different aspects of well-being, engagement with society and quality of life. But in order to measure everything, that can become quite burdensome to people. And if the trial is too burdensome to people, they'll drop out. And we don't want people to drop out. We need people to stay with us for a long time. So that's another balance that has to be struck. And I'm sure there's also been discussion that you'll have heard about making reducing variation in our sample, so the people who take part in studies, because Parkinson's we don't think is one disease. It's going to have slightly different causes or modifiers in different people. And so in order to trial a therapeutic and have the best chance of seeing a positive signal, we want those people in the study to be as similar as they can be, because if they are too different, we might lose our signal. And we've got to balance that against what I just said to you in the previous slide, which was the need for inclusivity in studies and to make sure that we have as diverse people, a number of people or groups of people taking part in studies as possible. So somehow this tension, and I think this is a really important tension, has to be managed within the way that we design our studies. So this is all perplexing, and in order to strike this right balance, we need the voice of the patient. We need the voice of people with Parkinson's, care partners, families, to guide us into where is that balance struck between these sort of scientific requirements versus things that are going to mean that our trial can be delivered. So there are many, many different decision points that go into designing a study, and the patient voice, participant voice, can help with all of these. So thinking about assessments, how do we measure Parkinson's? Even how do we measure movement? Do we do that with a wearable? Do we do it with a questionnaire? Do we do it with our part 3 examination? How often should we do it? How burdensome is it? A wearable that's something you just wear, a wristwatch that you forget about, hopefully won't be too burdensome. An app where you need to do something 3 times a day might be more burdensome. Having to come into a clinic in the off medication state will be even more burdensome. So where is that balance to be struck? How long can we do the study? And who are we going to include in the study? What sort of treatments are acceptable? Tablets, hopefully not so bad. If it's 20 tablets twice a day, maybe that's an issue. So where is that balance struck? Professor Bandman presented earlier in the other room today the UDCA trial results, and that was quite a high pill burden, and for a couple of patients did result in people not taking part in the study. How can a drug be administered in terms of its acceptability for participants? Tablets, of course, we'd hope would be quite acceptable, but the size of the tablet, I ran the statin trial. We had a patient focus group guiding us on the size of the capsule that was acceptable, because the way that the placebo is made often is that tablets are over encapsulated. So the drug is created and then they are wrapped up in a capsule to hide whether it's active or placebo. And so the tablets can be, quite significantly large. Which sites to select? We need the patient voice in that decision also. In the UK, I'll sort of forgive my UK centricity, but I'm not so conversant with US geography. So in the UK, we might have 5 sites in London. So that doesn't help the people that live in Scotland or Wales or the Southwest where I come from. They're not going to travel 4 hours to get to a study visit. So when we're thinking about our sites, it has to be ensuring that we can afford that trial opportunity to as many people as possible. And thinking about that, it might be that we can do some visits remotely. We could do visits via Zoom, or using questionnaires or through an app, or gathering data in a way that doesn't require that patient to travel hours into a study site, spend 2 hours trying to find parking and all the rest of it. So there are ways that we can make studies more accessible. We're very interested in the patient voice in consenting. So in our PD stat study, we did a follow-up study, or rather embedded within it, a qualitative study to understand from people taking part in it what it was like for them. And part of the PD stat study involved coming in the off medication state. And of course, we learned that was unpleasant and traumatic for everybody involved, the person with Parkinson's and their care partners, and indeed also the site staff, who did not enjoy seeing people in that sort of distressed state. And what came out of that was that maybe we weren't as explicit in the consenting as we could have been. So we did say to people, of course, they'd have to come in the off medication state. That might be difficult, but maybe we could have done something else to illustrate to people more what that was like. So we're thinking about that now for future studies, maybe an animation or a video, or asking people to describe their experiences, just so that consenting process is better meets the needs of participants. And then how we collect data and data handling issues, particularly with digitals and wearables and all the stuff that goes to the cloud, which, you know, is a magic black box of stuff in my head. I don't understand it, but who can see that data? Where does it go? What's the data security around that? We know that participants worry about this. And this, particularly if there's linkage to other sorts of data that may or may not be identifying, like one's genetic data. So we have to think carefully about data, and the patient voice in helping those decisions is really important. And then, of course, how do we communicate about the trial? If we want to get patients into a study, who better to ask than patients themselves? How can we encourage people to take part, get the opportunities out there, use networks and communication strategies that work for the people that we're trying to recruit into the study. And that might mean some really proactive community outreach activities, particularly if we're trying to engage people that we don't ordinarily engage. How we do that, what resources we need, and of course, thinking very carefully about equality, diversity, and inclusivity. So why do all this? So there are some a couple of nice reviews. This was one looking at the literature that's out there pertaining to trial, to the patient voice in trial design, and the sorts of domains of activity, a bit like what I've just talked about, where having patient voice, patient input into design can make a difference. So if we think about how useful that study is going to be, patient voice can help identify relevant research topics, so that whatever it is that's being investigated is something of relevance and meaningful to patients. For funding panels, they are now more and more wanting to see patient voice just woven into the application, because what that means for them, it isn't just, you know, some random clinician's thoughts about what might be useful, but this is being grounded in the reality of people living with Parkinson's or with whatever disease, that this is going to be, it's credible and of value. So that can help with funding decisions, and also ethical considerations, that if we have patients involved in the design of the studies, they will be more inclusive and sensitive to different cultural requirements. Patient voice in the method can have result in much more robust methodology. The wording and timing of the research instruments that we use, the scales, the measures, the instructions for how to use the app or the online tool, all of that can be enhanced and result in better data quality, which is what we need for a trial, robust data. And of course, making sure that everything that we give to people is accessible and understandable and in language that conveys the messages that we want to convey. And of course, the outcomes that we measure will hopefully be of value and interest and meaningful to people with Parkinson's. And of course, the regulators are very interested in this, that we're not measuring something where the value is hard to discern. So, you know, some aspect of movement in the limb might be a very sensitive measure to disease progression or drug effect, but it doesn't actually tell you how that drug is impacting that person's life. And of course, the overall study quality we hope then would be improved. So as a result of doing all of these things, we'll have a study which is easy to take part in, matters to patients, delivered in a way which is acceptable to patients. The measures are deliverable, the intervention is also acceptable and feasible. And what we'll hopefully have then is improved recruitment, because we'll also have better communication about the studies and improved retention in the studies. Improved trial experience and satisfaction for participants, that people will be able to adhere to the protocol, that they won't find it difficult, such as the pill burden, for example. Hopefully then studies will complete faster, and the findings from each study will be more impactful and more generalizable. And of course, these things can be measured. So if we want to get evidence for whether the patient voice in trial design is impactful, then these are the sorts of things that we can measure. Another nice review is this one from Bird a couple of years ago. And again, this was a systematic review looking at how we can do this. How can we get the patient voice into all of these different aspects of trial design and delivery? And they looked at studies that had done this, not specific to Parkinson's again, and studies that looked at the barriers and the challenges, and also things that facilitated good patient engagement and things that enabled that. And what they found was, and this won't come as any surprise for any of you, particularly who've been involved in trials, sitting on a trial management group or a steering committee or anything like that. It's very jargon heavy, of course, everything is. And even with best intentions, it's hard to weed out all the jargon from every meeting or set of papers. But what we can provide for people is glossaries and summaries and materials that people can refer to, and make sure that as much as possible, everything is in accessible language. The power dynamic is really important. If we are very keen that patient participants in our various groups, whether it's the trial management group or the study design group or the steering committee, they're partners in the undertaking, and that there is no hierarchy. Everyone's voice there is equal and everyone's opinion is valid. And in order to facilitate that being explicit and understood by everyone in the room, it's helpful to have ground rules which are written in upfront. We can support our patient contributors by briefing ahead of meetings so that they feel up to speed with whatever the topic is that's going to be discussed at that particular meeting, and then a debrief after the meeting to make sure that people have understood, that they're not thinking, oh, I didn't quite understand that, and giving a sort of a second opportunity to input if that wasn't available during the meeting. And of course, very good agenda management, making sure that the public or patient contributor voice is early on the agenda and isn't just the sort of a tag on at the end that never gets got to. Taking part in designing a study is not time neutral. It can be quite time heavy. And so we have to be mindful that, of course, this is quite burdensome. And if folk are retired and might have some more free time, it might be less burdensome than if folk are still working. And of course, some people are still trying to hold down a full-time job, or they might have caring responsibilities for grandchildren or whatever. And so expecting people to give up great chunks of the day, particularly if it's daytime, that can be quite difficult for people. And we certainly have found that. So we need to think about how we can allow people to have a voice, even if they're not able to attend meetings. And again, all of our as much as possible, we do Zoom meetings now, so these people can dial in without having to travel, which reduces that time commitment. And we also ensure that people have financial compensation for their time. So in the UK, we have something called, just gone completely blank, involve. Thank you. I had include in my head, but I knew that wasn't the right word. The involve guidelines, which are nice guidelines about the sorts of the sorts of activities that patient contributors should be compensated for, and the sorts of levels of compensation which would be considered acceptable. And funders expect to see this now in our applications, that we will just cost in our PPI patient contributor contributions according to the involve guidelines. We need to make sure that people taking part in these activities have enough knowledge and understanding of what it is that we're trying to do. And we can provide training for that, and most studies will. And then we can also tailor tasks to experience and expertise. So it's very easy to think that people with Parkinson's are people with Parkinson's and haven't had any other life. But of course people have, and people have immense expertise from their roles, either professionally or not professionally, and indeed expertise from their life with Parkinson's, from other activities that they might have been involved in, or communities or networks that they've been involved in. And like all of us, there are some things that some people love to do, like the communication, the dissemination, and other tasks that other people get really interested in, such as the wording of documents, or go doing the spell check and the grammar check. So or creating really nice infographics. People have just an immense range of really valuable skills and expertise that we can draw upon. Oops, and I've put lack of diversity here. With no enabler or facilitator. So in this publication, this was in the highlighted as a challenge, and we have found it a challenge, and I will come to that, but there was no enabler or facilitator listed in the review, but I'll come to how we are addressing that challenge in our study. So just very quickly, we are setting up a neuroprotective trial platform. It's the Edmund J. Safra Accelerating Clinical Trials in Parkinson's initiative, and this is something that I co-lead with Professor Tom Fultony at UCL. And the idea is to develop a platform trial for Parkinson's disease modifying therapies so that we can create a more efficient way of delivering trials. So just to talk you through that very quickly, the idea of this is that rather than having a placebo and standard of care arm versus one treatment, doing that for a few years or 2 years, maybe getting a positive or negative result, but then having to get the funding for the next arm and setting it all up again and doing the next trial. The idea is that we do treatments in parallel and compare them against a shared placebo. And the idea is that we would start that final sort of phase 3 trial, which the question for a phase 3 trial is, does this make my patient's life better? This interim analysis, which would be equivalent to a phase 2 trial, the question here is, does this drug work? So we want to know if the drug works, or more accurately, is there any signal at all that this might work, or is it definitely a dead duck, really? That's the interim analysis. And if there is any signal at all, then it would go through to phase 3. But that means that we can keep all this data in that final study. So we've shaved, this time period is likely to be 12 to 18 months off the duration of the whole trial. And of course, we haven't got all the sites shut down and set up that occurs here. So this will make the whole thing much more efficient. So in this particular example, say we started 2 treatments against a placebo at the start point, and then we did an interim analysis, and treatment B didn't show any signal at all to give any hope that this was going to be effective, that the drug was working, but treatment A did. We then want to know, is treatment A helping our patients? So treatment A carries on for the whole 3 years or whatever the whole study is. And when we chuck out treatment B, we can then bring in treatment C. So we've got this study now, or this new treatment being evaluated against placebo as well. So we're still recruiting to the placebo arm. So what this means is that we've got a machine that is going to keep evaluating treatments, and there are loads of treatments in the pipeline. So we're very optimistic that by developing this platform, we will have sort of an ongoing, perpetual disease modification trial for Parkinson's within the UK. So within that, creating this platform, we're very keen to have the patient voice central to what we are doing. We've split the working of this developing the platform into 6 different working groups. So one working group is looking at treatment selection, which treatments we should test in our trial. One is looking at the infrastructure, and by that I mean making sure that we've got sites. We'll need about 50 sites across the UK with the appropriate staff and training, and of course all those communication materials and being able to get the samples that we want and the measures that we want. We've got one group looking at trial design, another group looking at outcome measures. How are we going to measure Parkinson's? That final question, is this treatment helping a patient with Parkinson's? And also that initial evaluation, is there any sign that this drug works? And another group looking at funding and making sure that we can make this whole thing sustainable. And in each of these working groups, we have got 2 people with Parkinson's or a care partner. And together, these 10 plus Kevin McFarthing, who I'm sure you all know, who chairs the group, form the patient and public involvement group. And we make sure that we've got at least two. We've acquired a few more happy volunteers over the couple of years, actually. So I think we're up to about 13. So some groups, I think, have got 3 patient contributors. And the idea of having at least 2 was that we hopefully wouldn't burden one individual too much with needing to contribute. So this patient and public involvement group, they meet every 6 weeks. Of course, each of these working groups is having meetings, and some meet more often than others. So the infrastructure group, I think, meets 2 monthly. So these 2 folk here, they're meeting every 2 months to be on this infrastructure working group, plus every 6 weeks on the patient and public involvement groups. That's quite a high meeting burden. But what they do when they meet is they discuss what's gone on in each of the different groups, so that each of them, all of them, have a good understanding of the whole project and how their bit is contributing to the whole. And then it also allows to seek more views. So if there's something that's discussed in trial design, for example, that these 2 folk want to bring back to the whole group to say, what did you think about this? What do you think about a 5-year trial versus a 3-year trial, or whatever it is that's being discussed? Should we include people with deep brain stimulation or exclude people who've had deep brain stimulation? Those sorts of conversations, and they want to get more of an input into it, then they can bring that to the PPIE group and feed that back at the next working group meeting. And to facilitate all of this, we've created a nice series of documentation. So at the end, within the agendas, as I mentioned, the PPI voice part is the first agenda item at every meeting. And then after every meeting, there's a debrief between the PPI contributors and the chair of the meeting to make sure that everyone has understood exactly what's gone on, and to give that opportunity for further reflection. And there's a standard form which is then completed, and these are all filed on a shared drive of what the decisions were made and where there might be a need to seek more input. And then that area on the shared drive is where everyone who the PPI contributors can access. We also provide support. So there are lots of aspects of trial design that might be new to people with Parkinson's. A lot of them are new to me, some of the sort of statistical nuances. So we have PPIE forums to explain different statistical methods for doing, this or that, or to explain the modelling that we've based our trial on, or whatever. And increasingly, these PPI forums are a really good opportunity for a particular thorny issue to be thrashed out a bit more with our patient contributors, to really make sure we understand where they're coming from. The patients have a WhatsApp group, so this is just for them. There is no member of staff, professional funded through the application, or the investigators were not part of that WhatsApp group. That's just for them, and they find that very, very beneficial. And of course, they have central team support. So we've got a project manager, 2 administrators and 2 research fellows who work very closely with the PPIE contributors and make sure that if there are issues that are bothering them, or if they're struggling in any way, that we provide support early. We are evaluating the impact of having this input into our trial design in a couple of ways. We want to know whether all those methods that we've designed, whether they were acceptable, whether people found them easy to use. We also want to know whether they were effective. Did it actually make any difference to do this? And what the way to do that is to look at the decisions that we made and whether the patient voice influenced those decisions. So we are led by Marie. We're undertaking an evaluation to see whether the agenda, that process around the agenda item was actually met. Is this recorded in the meeting minutes? Were those debrief forms being filled in? So we can just check whether the processes seem to work just at a sort of operational level. And then we can use the documentation to see, was the patient voice, did it influence the decision that was made around various aspects of the trial design? And there's also another tool that we can that we have adapted slightly, called the patient engagement and research scale. Did people feel listened to? Did they feel that their contributions were valued? Did they feel involved in the process, those sorts of questions. And we're going to do that not just for the public contributors, but also for the other people, the professional members of the working groups. So did they feel that the patient voice was listened to? And we're going to do that at 6 monthly intervals throughout the duration of this 2-year project or 3-year project to see whether we're capturing this. And then we're also going to be undertaking some semi-structured interviews with those people with Parkinson's, their care partners, to understand what this process was like for them. Final bit of the talk. I mentioned that we have struggled with inclusivity and diversity aspects. So everyone, pretty much everyone in our PPIE group, bar one, is white. And we have struggled to get non-white representation in our PPIE group. And this has actually been a much harder challenge than we anticipated, to recruit people with Parkinson's who are non-white or who might come from harder to reach groups to take part in our PPIE group. And part of the challenge, at least for some of those groups, is that they don't generally access healthcare in the same way. So they're not engaging with healthcare, with research, with clinics in the same way as others. These are sorts of some of the underserved groups in Parkinson's, as we've talked about the geographic ethnicity, and within that is of course language, the language barrier, socioeconomic features. And then there are Parkinson's specific features, which mean that research or engaging with research at this level is difficult, such as speech problems, for example. So the challenges that we're trying to overcome here with a specific targeted approach to inclusivity is actually, it's really hard. The data around demographic inclusivity in trials, let alone in PPIE groups, is actually not recorded well. More so now for trials, but not really for PPIE groups. So we don't know how much of a challenge it is, apart from our own experience. And for us, we found it challenging. We don't know how to reach people that we're not reaching. I know it sounds a bit silly, but we know how to contact people who are part of the Parkinson's UK Research Network, or who receive the Cure Parkinson's newsletter. But how do we reach people who don't receive those things? How do we reach out to those groups? And then what are the barriers to research or engaging in research at all? There are some communities in the UK for sure, and I'm sure elsewhere, where there's a real mistrust of research, that people are guinea pigs, that they're being exploited. We saw all of this played out in the COVID vaccine studies, at least in the UK. Of course, the vaccines, we were hoping to recruit, particularly to the vaccine trials, the demographic that we knew that was hardest hit by COVID, which was people from Black and ethnic minority racial groups, ethnic groups. But there was a real mistrust of research amongst those groups. So understanding that and mitigating that is really important. There are language barriers, cultural differences, and of course some resource challenges. So if we're doing all of our meetings by Zoom, of course people need to have internet connectivity, they need to have a camera, they need to be able to use the software. And of course the communication, how we communicate in this sort of piece of work might not suit everyone's communication style or the way that they communicate most effectively. So we need to be mindful of that. So for example, I don't know if someone is particularly hard of hearing or has a significant visual impairment, they would find this very hard to engage in. So we are going to be we're addressing this by having a focused, targeted approach to setting up an EDI panel. So a separate group of people with Parkinson's, and I'll come back to that, not necessarily even with Parkinson's, to just educate us around some of the challenges of delivering a trial in different ethnic groups or cultural groups or geographical locations. So to recruit to this panel, because we have tried to recruit people with Parkinson's and we haven't found them easily. So the structures that are in place within the UK to get people involved in research in this way, of course, aren't just Parkinson's specific. But what we're going to do is look for people who've got chronic health conditions, living with a long-term condition, who come from different racial and ethnic groups, who might be in different locations or for particular socioeconomic backgrounds. And their experience of living with a long-term health condition, particularly in later life, will actually be of relevance, even if it isn't with Parkinson's. Ideally it would be, but it might not need to be. And then we can have their input and perspectives on some of the things that we're trying to do. So if we're setting up study visits around transport issues or a wearable, you know, for some cultures it might be really stigmatizing to have something that you're wearing a watch, for example. We need to understand that. And so some of that will be disease agnostic. Oops. And to do this, we're going to engage with community champions as well. So to reach some of the groups, going in through a mosque, for example, will be, or through a trusted community member will be a way to engage with communities that we're currently not engaging with. So I think I've probably covered most of that. So we've got two opportunities that I just want to highlight. One is to, as well as getting a broader EDI panel, we're also mindful that in our trial design, which we're hoping will be a trial for at least 1,600 people with Parkinson's in the first iteration, we've got 13 voices, and those 13 voices are not representative of everyone with Parkinson's. So there will be sense checks where we can take some of our decisions and just check that they're resonating okay with broader members of the Parkinson's community. So we're trying to establish a wider PPIE network for ad hoc input, or maybe to do some survey work, or just get a bit more of a sense of what's acceptable from a broader group. So there are two opportunities on our website, the ejsacpd.com website, for a Parkinson-specific network to seek a broader view from anyone with a lived experience of Parkinson's, and also specifically our EDI panel and those from ethnic minorities or more challenging socioeconomic backgrounds. So if you look on our website and in the sort of participation section, you'll be able to sign up if you're interested in either of those opportunities. So thank you very much for your attention. And I just want to thank particularly Georgia, who's our project manager, and Marie, who supports our PPIE working group, and they both helped pull these slides together for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that talk. We do have one question online. And so the question is, I think patients are learning along with their mentors and mentees. It is always free of charge on the part of the patient. In engagement, I don't think there is any reward for the patient.
Do you think that means financial reward? General incentives? Yeah. So that's an interesting comment. So for us, as I mentioned, if people are involved in these sorts of activities, we would expect for that to be compensated, or at least the offer of compensation. And this isn't without consequence, of course. Again, in the UK, if people are on benefits or they're receiving pension or pension credits, and they then have a supplementary income, that can affect their whether they're eligible for some, you know, yeah. So we just need to be mindful of that. But we certainly offer. But I would hope that people would find it rewarding. So I'll be very interested. This will form part of our evaluation of our processes, is did people feel that it was a rewarding experience to take part in the design of this platform trial, or indeed any trial, to be part of the steering committee or the trial management group. I don't know if that answers the question.
Any other questions?
Just a comment. I mean, this is a huge initiative, it seems, for you to be doing, and thank you, because I think if you do this well, we will all benefit from it. So thank you for all your time and effort.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you. Thank you. I mean, I did want to partly say, in response to the the previous question, of course, we all benefit, don't we, from taking part in these initiatives, and you know, our incentives are internal, as I'm sure most of yours are. The drivers are what sustains us through our careers, and these sorts of undertakings, they're not without challenge for sure.
All right, I think we're going to move on. Thank you very much, Dr. Carroll.